Hello, everybody. It is another great episode of Corporate Underground. It's a beautiful day here for those of us in Melbourne. We're out of lockdown. The sun is shining, which is why I'm outside today. For Portia, who looks like it's 4 a.m. and dark in London, we apologise, but we're here for another ep. Today, we're going to talk about a bit of a tricky one, a little bit deeper, a little bit more thinking required. Specifically, I thought in light of the big US election this week, which consumed a lot of people's time for many, many days, I've been thinking about what brings in change. So we've obviously just seen a change of presidency. And the question is, will it actually make any difference? Will the US change in any way? And in thinking about change, I started thinking about what is driving major change to systems. A lot of it is driven by ideology, and that's what we've seen in politics. And people have very specific ideas of what the world should look like and how things should be. And it's that perfectionist view of what the world should be like, and having it to be exactly as they want it, that often holds back a lot of change, because you can never make things exactly the way that you want them to be. And on the other side of the coin, the opposite of that coin, is this conservative incrementalism, this idea that we do things in baby steps. We'll get change, but we'll do it really slowly and we'll bring everybody with us. And in fact, both of those things can stop major change from occurring. One, because perfectionism stops it, and the other, because it goes too slowly. So I wanted to talk about that balance today between those two different things. So specifically, I am going to throw over to the Ayatollah of rock and roll to start us off today. And when you think about change, what do you think are the impediments to it? And do you think it's better to go slowly or quickly when trying to drive a major change?
How do we learn the frameworks that allow us to quickly, rapidly test our ideas? How do we become active listeners rather than, having a viewpoint and defending that viewpoint? It's all fine to have a viewpoint. So I'm in favor for more of a bull at the gate thing, because I guess that's who I am. I've been for a long time an innovator, and I like to push change through, because I find that if you try and drag everyone through and try and accommodate everyone, it becomes so politically mired down that nothing ever happens. And so, but I do believe heavily in understanding tools like design thinking, or other tools of being able to rapidly prototype. So for me, I'm a big believer in the ideology, but really validating it. And I'm guilty of it myself, and making sure I'm a listener. Like when I'm passionate about an idea, to be able to listen to other people. But yeah, look, I'm definitely in favor, much more in favor of, once you've got it, something validated, is just going for it. I find it too political and too slow to try and accommodate everyone's viewpoint.
Yeah, interesting.
Just to weigh in on that, I'm far from politically knowledgeable, okay? So I'll preface this as I speak. So I'm no expert on politics, but I feel that companies like that do the things that Finbar was just talking about, or that ability to rapid prototype and things like that, I'm worried that politicians don't have that luxury because they're not allowed. It's kind of like, I have to pick something and stick with it, because if I have any failure, even a small one, everyone just jumps on it. You know what I mean? The media jumps on it, the opposition jump on it. Everyone's going to hate anything. It's like a spark to a fire. Where in business, where you can get basically almost everyone or the bulk of people on your side, and you tell them failure can lead to success, and this is why we're going to do rapid prototyping and testing and stuff like that. But I just feel like politics is too big and too wrong to get to allow that.
But I guess, Tone, to my point, it's that active listening is by being able to, because things are changing so fast these days, it's being able to listen to the market. As a politician, you listen to the people. As a company, you look to trending analysis in markets. But it's a combination of the two. If you're not actively listening and understanding what's happening in the space, then you just become mired down in this, like, oh yeah, well, we'll treat change as this thing that we have to do because of some governance thing, rather than being able to be proactive rather than just always reactive.
I also think that companies are not really about consensus. It's not about having everybody represented in a decision. It's, some companies are flat structures, other companies are quite hierarchical. How do you get all the different perspectives to be represented, all the different cultures, or, income groups, or the industries, etc., to have a say?
I think it's got, I agree with Ayatollah over there, where it's about change and happening quickly. But I think one of the big things that Finn's got, he's got a deep knowledge that he starts to bring up, and he can offer that. And I see that happening with a lot of companies where they don't have that deep knowledge and trying to make changes that they're not used to, and they won't bring in help or assistance to do that. And they have capital burn, or they run out of cash, they run out of energy. Everybody comes in with a new idea and they have no control over it, so they're trying to do too many things at once. I am a great believer in getting something to happen and moving and learning from getting it wrong. And I see a lot of people won't take that risk to get it wrong, probably mostly because it's their money. And in politics, because they're punished so badly if they do get it wrong. I mean, if you look at any of the great politicians in the past, where they brought in a lot of change, they got voted out very quickly. It's only in hindsight if we look back and thank them for Medicare, we've thanked them for women's voting, we've thanked them for setting up art galleries and all these different things, because those were money that was taken away from people at the time. They didn't want that, and they were thrown out. And now we look back at those people as the heroes.
So Matty, that's a really interesting idea, and in fact, that is the exact point that I really wanted us to get to, and we got there earlier than I thought we might today, which is great. Well done. I am thinking about those things. I'm thinking about, racial injustice and women's voting. How do we bring about these major social changes that create greater equality or greater welfare for more people in environments where the tradition is to do things in tiny little increments? We just rip that band-aid off a tiny bit at a time, And for the people who haven't yet found that justice, they have to wait 20, 30, 40, 50, 100 years to get us to the point where we know we need to be, but we're just not prepared to rip that band-aid right off and go where we need to go. So where do you think, what do you think? We've just had, for example, in Australia, gay marriage was approved when we went to the public and asked them. And so there are a lot of people who are held back. Justice is held back because we're waiting for everybody to be comfortable with each little step, rather than just saying the majority know that it's right in some instances, and yet we're not prepared to make the full decision that's required to get there.
I think that's the thing about muddling through, right? Like referencing sort of, Lindblom's sort of thoughts in the 1950s, where somehow we've got to get to, a point where we can make a decision on something, unless if there's a critical mass, a critical number of people that want it. And so where is this in public debate? Where are, a number of these big decisions in the hands of the public, where they're actually discussing these in community groups or at school or wherever those decisions need to be considered, debated, or dialectics to come through?
So one thing, if you look at what the United Nations put together with SDGs for their 17 different steps for frameworks for future organizations, that to me is a framework, right? So that if you run it across those 17 steps and find a step or one or two or three, that's a way to validate. So that's when I'm talking about validation, it's what are the frameworks that we can cross-reference against to make sure that we are adhering to some sort of globally accepted standard or policy. And so I think that from my point of view, just to try and make sure I don't get misconstrued here, when I'm talking about validation, about ideation or ideas, it's about having what are those standards. And if those standards exist, which they do, there are standards for good business. There are standards for SDGs. There's more and more of this stuff coming up. But if you can validate across that, your ideas can be then validate across a baseline, and it can then come out to sort of, if the mission of the organization is in line with one of these sort of standards, great. If those standards don't exist, it gives an opportunity for organizations who want to change, who know that they need to change in the future, to start to think, rather than just changing all the time, why don't we get together with our peers and create a standard that people adapt to? And then that can be something that we can actually flesh ourselves across. Those standards exist in every sort of regulated business in the world. So the regulators have a set of criteria that you need to adhere to. And why isn't that applied to change?
So can I ask you then, that's a really interesting question, Finn. So if we take one of the largest issues of our time, which is climate change, this is a time-sensitive issue, right? And so I'm very interested in Tia's views as well, because I know this is in her area of expertise. But the science tells us that there is a fixed amount of time that we have to do something about these problems. And we have some countries who are rapidly investing in those changes and saying we're going to make the changes necessary to get us to where we need to be and where the science tells us we need to be. And we have others who say, well, we're going to incrementally get there, and we're going to trial a few things here and trial a few things there. When we have issues that are time dependent, do we still have that luxury to lay out all of that infrastructure and that framework?
I think the framework's easy. I don't see it as something that needs to take 5 years. It's like, why can't one of those things, that one of the impediments to not aligning to a global standard, which already exists potentially, is to then start to put some financial imperatives on organizations. I don't know. Look, I'm not a climate change guy, but look, I'll put it back to you. What do you think, Tia?
The toughest aspect of climate science is that the experience of climate change, right, that which is happening outside your window, is asymmetric. If everybody was experiencing everything at the same time, the fires in California, the fires in Australia, you may get some information about the Californian fires, but it's in the news, and perhaps, if you have some friends in California who are telling you their experiences, maybe you've got a sister in California for which reason you really believe that this is actually happening and it's affecting their life. But if you're sitting somewhere where none of these experiences are happening to you, it is such a them situation and not a me situation, for which reason making decisions on something that is a non-experience for you can actually be quite difficult to put into perspective.
But then why don't you just make it an experience for you? If you had a global standard where
how do you make a global experience, which is like a minimum viable shop, to educate people about what's happening in multiple places in and around the world?
But Tia, we just did have an experience that was global. It was called COVID, and we all shut our doors and we all had the same experience.
But is that climate change, right? The denial for COVID at the beginning of COVID is actually quite similar to the denial for climate change.
But
somewhere, someone is getting sick from COVID, but I don't believe it, right?
We all experience it at the same time. Now, there was a point where it's saying that the environment is fighting back, because as we destroy more forests and we destroy more things, we uncover Ebola, we uncover a whole bunch of diseases and things that are happening. People are starting to eat different animals, things that we haven't done before. There's a lot of things where nature and ourselves are merging closer and closer. So those diseases are coming from from the degradation of the planet. But remember one thing, we all have to agree on one thing. The planet doesn't need us. We need the planet, right? And that's the simple thing. We all look at it like the planet needs us. It doesn't. It's actually doing better right now in the last 6 months, where you can see the Himalayas for the first time in 20 years. You can see dolphins swimming in Florence, which haven't happened for 100 years. You've got all these things where the planet's going, hey, we're doing really well. You're the parasite. Get off our backs. Now, just on one more point, we've known about systems and processes on how to save lives for decades. There's a good a person I know very well who went to Africa and set up and has now saved millions of lives for the simple point of putting food in silos. That's it. That's all he did. Walked out that he had to organize the roads and the land to connect. And Costa did all this. Now, the UN came to him and he went to them and said, we need more money to invest. And they turned around and said, oh, look, we need more proof. He turned around and showed it to 500,000 different villages all connected, saved millions of lives. And then they turned around and give him the UN award for humanitarianism. And he turned it down because he said, you've known about this for 50 years, 100 years on what to do. The system, the process was there. It wasn't implemented. The UN knew how to do it. We've known how to store food. They used to put it under their beds because it was a way to protect it. They had no refrigeration. We know what to do. We didn't do it. They didn't have the money to do it. And one man started small and made that happen. The UN's known about it for a long, long time. It's not about what we know. It's about implementing those things and making.
I think the thing about the Bretton Woods in the 1940s is to try and create some sort of global level decision making on global level experiences, or
but
effect. Right?
At the end of the day, it stops action. It stops action because everybody's, oh, hold on, let's get another bunch of consultants to come in and write another paper that shows what the 20 years ago they did. And they spend all this time. You look at Haiti, you look at all these places where people have come in and tried to put a global response into a local area. It just stops. One woman flew in there and started handing out credit cards and money, got things happen where the government wouldn't do anything.
Maddie, but I think that this is the exact issue, right? So this is why I wanted to have this conversation, because there's the action and there's the inaction. There's that how long do you keep the, because I think the action for the sake of action leads to all sorts of problems. Because yes, and as somebody who's come out of the entrepreneurial space, if all you do is just act and you haven't done any work to understand the market, to understand the product, to understand how to deliver this thing right, then you're bound for all sorts of heartache. If all you do is sit on the research and never act, well, you're never going to get there anyway, right? And so the question is, how do we find this balance where we know change is required between doing enough of the getting it right and then doing enough of the let's actually do something?
So I did a big piece of crisis work for a big religious organization in Australia, and it was very fascinating when we went in and did the discovery process on the organization. And one of the greatest learnings for a religious organization that we found was a church has been focused for hundreds of years on not changing, staying to their doctrine. That's their thing. Yet they were in the face of child sexual abuse, problems at schools. So they were in the face of change where they had to change. Yet the organization was focused on not changing. So they had competing different things. What we did was put a very simple sort of validation in their decision making. They didn't realize that by not making a decision was making a decision, and the consequences of not making a decision. For example, I'm not saying that this was the case, but if you don't make decisions and you don't stand hardline against pedophiles coming into your organization, they're going to come in there. Right? So the consequence from not making a decision is great. Now, by being able to validate, it might be a time period. If you don't put this organization together or you don't act within a certain period of time, that's a consequence in the decision making by not making a decision. Starting to evaluate in a more holistic 360-degree component of what are the components of decision making here, because it doesn't affect me, or it's the earth, or it's I'll be dead by that time. So I'm so busy worrying about my thing. But one of the consequences might be if I'm not responding to shareholders, they're going to leave my fund, and so you've got to start looking at your decision making rather than a binary yes or no. It's what are the different parameters involved in making a decision. And I just don't think people think about all the different impacts. And so just because it's not happening to you, the typhoon, it doesn't mean that you might not be flooded tomorrow. It does not mean so it's this. What I don't know what that might look like, but I just don't think people are thinking about the decision making on should I do it or shouldn't I do it. They just evaluate it on, is it going to affect my bottom line? But they don't look a bit deeper in, well, it might affect your bottom line if you're not making the right decisions for your customers.
There's also the issue with how questions get prefaced. Okay, so like I see this all the time, and we all do it, and you don't even know when it's happening to you. But like, for example, in the corporate world, if your boss comes, sits in a board meeting and goes, all right, guys, we've been told we have to do this meeting. I think it's bull crap, but we're going to talk about this. Tell me what you guys think. Like, he's just set, probably sometimes subconsciously, that what we're going to discuss today, I don't agree with. And he's the boss. He's the leader. Okay. Now, media does this and leaders do this. They'll come in with their agenda and they'll say that, they'll lead facts with their view of it. You know what I mean? They'll say climate change is bullcrap, and then you can find data on any argument you ever want, ever. In digital marketing, I can make any report look good. I could just pick a sample of data. So that's the issue: is that people are prefacing information before that when they announce it to public to learn. It's like, okay, guys, we're going to do a documentary about climate change and how false it is. Okay, like. That's not a documentary. You know what I mean? Like, that's not informing people. News outlets do it, and then politicians do it. So people need to be aware of when they're getting facts that are prefaced, that are biased.
I think that's the thing about having partial information. Right? You've got partial information, not the entire truth, not the entire picture. It's
entire information?
Right? But we're never ever going to get there, because
Exactly.
even the fact, the fact that we're always operating with a certain bit of information or factual knowledge or experience, or whatever you want to put it as, means that we've got to go back to that sort of pnyx, right? Like the Greek discussion point, where you go back and everybody's there to discuss what's really going on. Like, well, what's your experience? What's your experience? And it was interesting for democracy to be designed in a place where women were not even invited to that conversation. Still got that Aristotelian sort of rigor in academia. You've got the Socratic dialogue of the social, the discussion and how that comes about, the questions that we ask. You've also got the the development of the emotional stoicism, right? Like what does it mean to make a decision when you aren't so emotionally driven about this? Finn, you were talking about this, I think, a couple of episodes ago, where you said, if I'm about to get emotional, I'll step back so that, I can deal with my emotions, I can process my emotions and not allow my emotions to drive the decision making.
I totally agree with that. I just, Adam, I think, to your point in your original question, if we looked at the reasons for change being either reactive or proactive, if you're reactive, typically there's emotion tied into that because you're reacting to something urgently because of a market condition change. But when you're proactive, you're looking for those changes and you're actually scanning for a deeper level of understanding of the market, of your customers, of the problem, and you're validating that. So I think if a simple step was if we could start to move thinking about change from a proactive mindset rather than a reactive mindset, it might encourage greater speed, greater effectiveness, because to be proactive, you've actually got to get a better sample of the data. But
what does it mean to have like preventative governance?
Yeah.
Which is effectively what we're asking, right? Proactive means that you are preventatively looking at
100%.
Climate change. So it's not, oh my God, that we've got a mudslide and now we don't have anywhere to live. It doesn't go to the extreme circumstance that then the incrementalist argument doesn't exist anymore.
Correct.
Because
so
it's like,
let me give you a different example then, because I think you're right. Because when there is science involved, when there is data, where there is fact, it starts to change your ability to make those decisions, because you just reach a tipping point of data where you go, we weren't sure before, we are sure now, a decision needs to be made. Let's do something slightly different. Let's talk about gun violence in America. And so in gun violence in America, you have this situation where morally what you're seeing happening, you have this really two edges of the sword. You've got people who are going, it is my fundamental God-given right to have a gun, and that's the end of the conversation. And no matter what's going on in the world, just because some people don't know how to use them shouldn't encroach on my right to be able to carry and be a responsible gun owner. On the other hand, you've got a whole lot of kids getting killed in schools. And you've got people saying, well, hang on, what we need to do is have a change. And when you look at this absolutism and you look at the incrementalism, it really comes to the fore here in this issue, because you've got absolutists on both sides. You've got absolutists going, there should be no guns. That's never going to happen in the United States. And you've got absolutists who are saying you shouldn't be able to make any changes to the laws. My rights are my rights. Nothing should ever change about that.
But you're right, Adam. But that's a very binary viewpoint. If you go the next level down, like I lived in America for 8 years, so you've got people who go, "It's my God-given right. I want to hunt. I want to protect myself. What happens if someone comes in my house with a gun?" And so if you go that next level down and you start to understand that, then you can say, I'm going to put an education program to people who are fearful. They want a gun to protect themselves against other people with guns. That's a different way to communicate,
Militarization never disarms. By militarizing a community of people, right? Like giving them a gun and saying, hey, look, you've got a gun, I've got a gun. You think that someone's going to put their gun down because you've got a gun?
No, but it's not. It's this narrative in their heads that is stopping them. That's saying I need to have a gun, because whether it's actually got any basis of fact or not, it's like seatbelts. It's like smoking. It's like, but the problem is these things take time to educate people.
Yeah, what's fascinating about this particular one, this is such a heated conversation, this gun conversation, and I lived it when I was in America. When I spoke at one of the March for Our Lives rallies, and I got to speak to people that were open carry people who came to protest the fact that kids were there saying no guns, and I got to speak to all the kids. And so it was this extraordinary ability to see both sides. What happened when all the cameras were off and all the crowd left this enormous rally, we went and we sat with the gun people. I took some of the kids and we sat there for an hour and we listened to each other. And what was amazing about that experience is that the open carry folk, were basically saying, listen, we don't want our kids and our grandkids to get murdered in school. Of course we don't. We also want to be able to keep our guns. We're not saying to you that you shouldn't be able to take rights away. What we're saying to you is that the rights that you've already taken away, you aren't actually enforcing. So before you come to us and say we want to take more away, actually do the enforcement of the ones that you have, and then let's see if that works. And then we can go back, and if it's not working, we'll be the first people to volunteer to take more rights away, because clearly something needs to be done about this. And part of the problem is that when you come from an absolutist perspective, either side of the spectrum, or you say, we're going to do this really, really slowly, we're going to incrementally make these tiny changes, you don't actually get to any meaningful change that makes any difference for anyone. And that's the big, I think that's the big challenge that the new incoming president has.
You said something really important that was an artifact for me, which is exactly what I started with, the ability to listen, right? You sat with both sides, right? When you're on either side of the argument, you don't do that, right? Because you're standing for a viewpoint. So to be able to understand and evaluate how to make these decisions and change, you've got to get a full understanding of the actual position. You can't just be, I'm going to force change because this is my position. You need to actually be able to understand both sides of the argument. And I just think that that's a skill that's really, it's really fundamentally flawed, because we're not doing it. And if we were doing it, I think it would really help us facilitate change in a more meaningful way.
The other issue is that reasonable thoughts don't get screen time, okay? They never put someone on the news that's got a very good, this is what we should do. It's always the guy that says, you take away my gun, I'll shoot you all. And then there's the guy saying we should all, put flowers in them. And, like it is always the extremes. There's no, it's like, like if we actually got to hear everyone's thoughts on it, like no one thought Trump would win because they were like, every TV news was like, no chance. And then he got votes, because just because something's on TV doesn't mean that's what everyone thinks. So we got to actually start getting the idea that this is the one time in our history where we can all share everyone's opinions. Okay, we can actually get access to everyone's thoughts digitally instantly. We don't have to do a big thing anymore. We don't have to rely on polls that get 50 biased
Tony,
people.
If you could evaluate multiple pieces of evidence, media might be one of those channels.
Just because, a President Ronald Reagan didn't have the same amount of information that we do, we also don't have the ability to process all that information, despite there being even more access to information today. So as an individual living today, in comparison to somebody 50 years ago, yes, there is way more access to information, and there is information that can be gathered from different parts of the world. However, how much of that can I process? So that's not equal.
So,
right?
Just ask a question to Adam on this one, right? Because this leads down to something I've been thinking about for a couple of weeks now. So if you look at democracy, we want democracy to have more people voting than ever before. The more people that vote, the better, the more of an understanding you're going to get, and the more people that are going to be involved. So I'd say everybody here would agree that democracy is a good thing. So if you look at what Donald Trump's just done, he's had more votes and lost than Obama did when he won. So Trump, by doing what he's done, has actually given more people a reason to vote, both for his side, or whatever side you want to call that voted for Trump, and you've got more people involved in politics to vote against that. And it still came down to a bee's dick, right, of how close it really got in a lot of areas.
4 million people. Yeah.
For our international guests, that's very, very small.
I think that with the democracy and you want change, Trump's come in and made a whole bunch of changes, good or bad. Now, for a lot of people, they were good. For a lot of people, they were bad. In the middle, I'm looking at some of those things. I can see both sides on that, right? But he's actually given more people the vote than ever before in a country that had a very low turnout. So more people are interested, and yet people seem to be more appalled at that than what they should be.
I think there are a couple of things. The first thing, just to answer your question, I don't think you should confuse an election with a democracy. They're fundamentally different things. Going out and people having a vote about who they want to oppress them is not the same as having a democracy. And in this instance, whoever's winning that election, they're going to be oppressing.
That's your point, Jackley. I mean, the thing is, polling went out, and so many people didn't even get involved in it because they were so pressurized not to be able to do that. Their voice came out. They said what they wanted to do. It's not our country. It's sure, it's involved, but they voted, and your team won or my team won. That doesn't matter. Somebody came in. Now, that is going to change, but I see this as being a positive in a lot of ways because more people are now involved in a conversation than just quietly getting on with what they were going to do.
To answer your question, I think your question
That was change.
to be answered appropriately. No, it's not. It's a moment of time. I think if the same number of people turn out in 4 years at the next election, when Trump is not running, then I think we've learnt that it's engaged more citizens. If the only reason they're voting is for an individual in a window of time, then the democracy is no stronger. That faux democracy is no stronger. You're looking at people saying, I align with a particular person or a particular view, and therefore I'm going to come out and do this, rather than I recognize that I need to get involved in this process more because it affects my life. And we don't know what the truth is to that yet. It's still too early to know. But we have reached the end of this episode, and I can see everybody still itching. So I'm going to let the final word is this. Rather than giving your view on the topic, which is what we usually end with, I want you to give a message to the incoming president of the United States based upon the topic.
Kanye West.
So if we are talking about making positive change, whatever your perspective of positive change is, if you could give President-elect Biden one piece of advice to create positive change in America, what would your piece of advice be? Who wants to go first?
I'll go first. Don't be a sore winner. There's a lot of people that didn't vote for you, and encompass them as well, because it will only polarize if you don't. Further, it doesn't need to. Not one word, many words.
Thea?
Time to turn the Paris Agreement around, please.
I reckon that's going to happen pretty quickly. Tony?
I don't know. I feel like I watch America and how it's so two-sided. I'll just say start talking to your citizens, talk to Americans and not your party. I don't see the point in talking to one color and not the other.
Ayatollah?
Mine would be, if you're going to spend that much money on defense, have the defense rebuild the nation. Spend money on rebuilding the nation, not on invading other countries.
Beautiful. The word of non-Americans has spoken. We have all given the president some advice.
And yours, Adam?
Mine. I think I would just say acta non verba. It's time to actually do the things that you're talking about. It's time to stop talking about things and start doing some things.
Yeah.
Corporate Underground is out. Till next week.